Well, welcome everybody. Uh, Thanks for joining us. I cannot see you, but I hope you can see both of us. We are very fortunate to have Harith, CEO founder for Fractyl, and actually Harith came, was it over a year ago? You were one of our panel for the Roseman Symposium, and so hopefully next year we can be back to the old way. But I was talking to Harith just during the pandemic and see how much the pandemic has impacted all of us, and at the same time, when you look at the progress that Fractyl is doing during this pandemic, during the summer, has been really impressive. You keep knocking on one after the other. You have the ID approved, and then you got your financing round closed. I feel like the pandemic has not impacted you from the outside. And I'm sure there's a lot of challenges going inside. And I thought it would be great for Harith to share with you the challenges that he faced and how he overcome that challenges. And maybe we all can learn a few things from him today. So with that, I mean, a little bit background, I think the description is about Harith, like he's an MD. He was in Stanford before he did his medical school. So he kind of like spent some time in the Bay Area, and actually we did a podcast with Harith, so you can hear a lot about his journey at that podcast. But on this talk, we will talk more about specific on the topic that he's going to talk about today. So with that, Harith, take it over.
Thank you, Christine. Really appreciate it, and really appreciate the invitation. Just going to take a second to share my screen. Awesome. So thanks to those of you in the audience. Christine and I talked about the impact of COVID, which is something that all of us have been facing and will continue to face for some time. And asked if I would be willing to talk a little bit about COVID and the impact that it had on our business. So that's the provenance for the discussion today. Imagine yourself back on January 1st, 2020, beginning of this year. You're an optimistic entrepreneur. You're coming out of the holidays. You've been busy building your company. You're enthusiastic about your mission. You've been proselytizing your story to anyone who'd be willing to listen, and excited about your team. You've done strategic planning in the last quarter of 2019. You have specific milestones that you feel are going to set you up for success in 2020. And even better, the economy is doing great. The market is strong. And then you realize, in the midst of all of that ebullience, that a problem has actually already emerged in another part of the world, whose impact you have not yet even begun to contemplate. And when you least expect it, this black swan event that has emerged, before you know it, it's going to force you to alter all of your best laid plans. So a black swan, as many of you know, is a term famously coined by Nassim Taleb to refer to an observation or an event that you would never have predicted until you stumble upon it. I mean, in this case, we all knew about the systemic risks that we face from infectious diseases, and we live in an interconnected society. And so if you develop an infectious disease in one place, there's a risk that it's going to spread throughout the world. But I would dare say that none of us entrepreneurs have a specific plan in place that we can just pull off the shelf and dust off to prepare ourselves for this situation. I remember quite ironically, actually, the first time that I realized the impact of COVID-19, I was in Hong Kong very early in the year. I had been traveling in Asia to meet with investors, to learn about the opportunity for our company in Asia, and to round out a financing round. We had a term sheet for our financing in Q4. We are now working on filling out the rest of the round, meeting with investors in Asia, Hong Kong in particular. And it really became clear to me that something had really fundamentally changed. Investors that we had planned to meet were distracted by news of a flu-like virus coming out of China. I've spent a lot of time in Asia in the past. People typically wear surgical masks more so than they do in the United States, but even relative to norms. There were a lot of people walking around with a surgical mask. My meetings were getting canceled. There were partner meetings that were supposed to occur that couldn't be scheduled because people were sick or quarantining at their homes. And though it hadn't yet come to the United States, I knew that something was up. And I just didn't know anything more about what impact this would have, other than the narrow impact that it was having on those conversations that I was hoping to have in Hong Kong and in Asia at that time. So the first couple months of the year were really full of such tremendous uncertainty. January, you're hearing, what is this virus? Is this going to be another SARS-like event with a lot of Asian health concern, but relatively limited global impact? How serious is it? Now, flash forward to February. Cases have been reported in the United States. How far-reaching is it going to get? Is it going to get worse? Fast forward to March. Massachusetts, New York, California are all on lockdown. People are wondering, how long do you think this will last? Do you think this will last till June? If not, how long could it possibly last? How long would it be? How bad will it be? And now you start getting into existential questions. Are we going to be able to close our financing? Can Fractyl survive this? What are we going to tell our board? What are we going to tell our employees and our broader investors? Now, as entrepreneurs, we're all working to build our businesses, focusing on our technology, clinical evidence development, market development, financing, company building. Along comes this massive, totally unexpected disruption. It alters everything that you had otherwise been planning to accomplish. Your team and your investors are looking at you. What are you going to do? Today, I'm going to share my company story over the past 8 months and how we've dealt with COVID-19 so far. I hope that our experience may be helpful, not only as you navigate your path through this virus at your own companies, but I also think I can share some general principles that I've developed in dealing with this episode. I hope that those general principles will be helpful more generally. You know, an approach to preparing for and then dealing with the possibility of some unforeseen yet cataclysmic disruption actually occurs from time to time. I mean, COVID-19 may be a once in 100 years thing, but there are a lot of different once in 100 years sorts of things that happen all the time. And so the focus of this talk is going to be a little bit on Fractyl, but not on Fractyl per se. What I'd like to do is share a little bit about our company for context, and a lot has been written about COVID's impact in particular. So in preparing for this talk, I've been focused on what are the general principles from COVID that we might apply as we think about how to survive and thrive through these periods of gross disruption for which we are not prepared. And today we're going to spend the next 20 to 30 minutes walking through 3 simple ideas that I've really been focusing on to help us at Fractyl cope with COVID so far. And the concepts on which I've entrained my mind this year are to, number 1, focus on our priorities. Number 2 is to preserve our principle, cash is king. And then 3rd is to really redouble our emphasis on the importance of our people and empowering them to do great work. But let me start by telling you a little bit about myself and our company. So I had, growing up, family members with type 2 diabetes. My father had type 2 diabetes. My uncle had type 2 diabetes. These were successful people who were busy trying to write their own version of the American dream and developed type 2 diabetes in their late 30s, early 40s. And so my first experience with this disease was through my own personal experience and seeing my father and my uncle deal with the challenges of blood sugar control, the risk of developing an ulcer in the foot, contemplation about starting insulin and measuring blood sugar on a regular basis and how that changed their lives. I entered medicine after, Christine said, after I finished my undergraduate at Stanford. I went to Hopkins, I did my medical training, and then I trained further in Boston as a cardiologist and as a physician scientist. And I actually thought that I was going to be an academic physician scientist working on the molecular genetics of cardiovascular disease. And I was heading down that path and thinking about what research areas to focus on when, while talking to my Ph.D. research advisor, he suggested that I try to think about focusing on problems that I was seeing in my clinic that felt either unsolved or unexplained. And so I was really lucky to find a problem that I thought was actually not only unsolved and unexplained, but actually a much larger problem that had been framed perhaps incorrectly and much larger than I could possibly have imagined. So in my clinic, I saw a lot of patients with the overlap of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And the paradigm of care in type 2 diabetes when I was training in medicine was treat to target, meaning lower blood sugar by whatever tools you have available. Physicians quickly turned to insulin therapy, and that in turn made Lantus an $8 billion a year drug. But I knew that my patients really hated taking insulin. They hated the effort of it, the weight gain, the risk of low blood sugar. I found it devilishly hard to control blood sugar to goal in my patients, in a majority of my patients. And I wondered, because I was a trainee, I wondered, am I doing something wrong here in how I manage the disease? And then a series of publications started to come out, actually showing that lowering blood sugar with insulin doesn't actually improve cardiovascular risk. As a cardiologist, the patients came to me and they said, hey, doc, my endocrinologist wants me to start on insulin. And I knew that heart disease is the single biggest thing that patients with type 2 diabetes are supposed to worry about. Yet insulin does not actually lower cardiovascular risk in people with type 2 diabetes. So that seemed strange. And another issue emerged. What are we actually accomplishing by lowering blood sugar? When you think about it, we're treating a symptom of type 2 diabetes, not the disease itself. Are we just putting a Band-Aid on the problem while allowing the underlying disease to continue to progress and to worsen? And are we serving patients and society well with this glucose-focused approach? So I could tell patients were unhappy, insulin's a problematic therapy. We're just putting a Band-Aid on a symptom of a disease rather than treating the disease itself. And then I kept wondering, like, is this a problem that I'm having, or is this sort of a general problem? But it felt like a very interesting one because I didn't think it was something that I was necessarily doing wrong. And actually digging in further, it kind of became clear to me that I was not alone in having a hard time helping my patients achieve good blood sugar control. In fact, actually, if you look at more recent statistics, although the story was already being told, when we started the company in 2011, population level statistics tell a really interesting story. We're having a very hard time in society managing blood sugar, despite having an increasing number of medicines that we have available to us to try to control the disease. Inherent in this graph is a really interesting conflict. We have over 50 drugs available, but the percentage of patients who are actually achieving disease control, shown on the red line, is actually worsening. And I thought to myself, in every patient visit, if I saw a patient every 3 months, I could adjust a dose of their medicine or swap one of their diabetes medicines and never run out of therapeutic options in their entire lives. Like, the number of therapies we have is that vast. And yet the proportion of patients with good control is actually worsening rather than improving. So what's the next therapy going to do that the first 50 have not accomplished so far? It really got me thinking, like, why are we not able to get patients under control with their type 2 diabetes? And a really scary thought began to emerge. It really was clear to me that most patients with type 2 diabetes, more often than not, have multiple coexisting medical conditions. They're often on multiple medicines a day, often 2 or 3 medicines for their hypertension, for their cholesterol, for their cardiovascular disease. And the net result of all of this is that an average patient in my clinic with type 2 diabetes is taking 8 or 9 medicines. Now, I'm just going to ask you all a rhetorical question. Have any of you tried to take 8 or 9 medicines every day on a daily basis for chronic diseases that are otherwise totally asymptomatic, perhaps including one that's an injection that actually causes you to feel hungry and to gain weight? What if we've reached the limit of what people can achieve with the way that we're currently managing chronic diseases? What if patients are at their limit of what they can do on a daily basis to manage their conditions? I feel like what we've done is we've hit an asymptote of real world effectiveness, just driven by the success and the promulgation of all of the medicines that we have for all of the chronic diseases with which we've been diagnosed. And that then led me to realize in diabetes in particular, we either need to prevent people from getting disease in the first place, or we need to reduce disease burden entirely if we really want to make a real world impact. So Fractyl was born out of that objective. Our mission is to figure out how to reduce disease burden in type 2 diabetes in a scalable manner that addresses root cause, as opposed to developing another way of symptomatically managing the condition. And I'm just going to briefly summarize some of the science behind the approach and then the technology, just to give you a flavor for what we're talking about. So one of the things that really became very interesting in 2010, as I started reading more about diabetes, is that there are certain forms of bariatric surgery that were having an immediate weight-independent effect on blood sugar lowering. And no one really had a good explanation for why that was, although it was getting harder and harder to deny the evidence that somehow doing a surgery on the intestine, not touching the pancreas at all, has this remarkable effect on insulin resistance and blood sugar. And then in 2010, a paper came out of Copenhagen, which is sort of summarized on the right-hand side, showing that a patient with type 2 diabetes underwent what's called a Roux-en-Y gastric bypass surgery. Their diabetes went away. In a Roux-en-Y, you bypass the stomach and the duodenum, so food just goes from the esophagus, basically directly through a small pouch and then into the middle portion of the intestine called the jejunum. In this case, the patient got a gastric tube placed into their stomach, and then they were refed through their duodenum after their surgery had made their diabetes go away. And the surgeons reported that immediately after refeeding the duodenum, they showed that blood sugar worsened. And in fact, the patient's diabetes seemed to just come right back. So somehow from one day to the next, the exposure of nutrients to the duodenum was like this on-off switch for type 2 diabetes. That really got my head scratching. You know, we knew in medical school that the gut is the body's largest endocrine organ. We know that it releases hormones into the body in order to help regulate blood sugar throughout the day, whether you're eating or not eating. The gut's the first part of your body to know whether food's coming and what kind of food is coming. And so as we dug into the science, we observed that diets that are high in fat and sugar, like a typical McDonald's type diet, causes a thickening or hyperplasia of the lining of the duodenum, which is this part of the gut that's bypassed in a Roux-en-Y. And we became convinced that the changes to the lining of the duodenum are actually fundamental to why we develop insulin resistance in the first place, and that it is this hyperplasia that causes the risk of diabetes, risk of NAFLD-NASH, and perhaps contributes to the risk of cardiovascular disease associated with high fat, high sugar diets as well. And then we also knew that there's like this great human experiment where bypassing the duodenum showed that you can immediately improve diabetes just by bypassing this part of the gut. So you know that this target is pretty meaningful and impactful. But I also knew you can't just wave a magic wand and offer bypass surgery to 25 million people, even though that would probably be very helpful for society. So the question that we then asked is, what would it take to develop an angioplasty type solution for type 2 diabetes? And that's really the provenance of Revita duodenal mucosal resurfacing, which is the product that we've been developing for the type 2 diabetes market. It's a first-in-class procedural therapy targeting what we believe to be the root cause of metabolic disease in the duodenal mucosa via a catheter-driven ablation and then the inherent mucosal regeneration of the gut. And we've done a lot of clinical trials so far, and most recently a prospective randomized double-blinded sham-controlled feasibility study in patients with inadequately controlled type 2 diabetes, showing that we lower blood sugar, we lower liver fat, we improve weight, and we improve insulin resistance, all compared to a sham procedure. We updated our CE mark. We signed an agreement to commercialize Revita with HCA Hospital System in London in the first part of the year. And we were working with the FDA on our pivotal study. And in fact, when all of that scenario that I just described happened, while we were sort of raising our Series E financing and in the midst of preparing for commercialization, thinking about our pivotal study, that's when we were asking all of those question marks around COVID and how it was going to impact everything that we were otherwise planning to do. Now, before I come to COVID and its impact, I would like to just make a brief plug as an aside, because most of you are device developers, that I believe that these observations that we've made in type 2 diabetes and the limit of population level effectiveness from polypharmacy is actually true for a range of chronic diseases: cholesterol, hypertension, COPD. I just believe we've simply hit the asymptote of the number of medicines that we can expect patients to reliably take on a daily basis. And I think that incremental advances are going to, from where we are now, in order to improve real world health, population level health, are going to require not just new molecular targets, but entirely new approaches with new product forms. I personally, speaking my own book, tend to believe that scalable device-based procedures targeting pathophysiology offer an incredible opportunity to align patients, physicians, and payer interests in a way that drugs simply cannot. After all, patients are really looking for better health with fewer medicines. That there's really no doubt about that. And most physicians are really not satisfied to just be fiduciary partners to their patients to simply help manage a progressively worsening chronic disease. People don't go into medicine to just watch health deteriorate and then to catalog that process. There's really no beauty or satisfaction in that kind of medicine. They would love to be physicians in general, speak as one myself, would really love to be able to do things that help turn the tide on disease on behalf of their patients, so long as it's safe and effective. And I also believe that it's pretty evident that payers who are dealing with the expense of these major chronic diseases are looking for more reliable, more dependable, real-world outcomes. All of these diseases have a surfeit of generic therapeutic options, and yet we haven't solved the problem of these conditions. So I think one of the things that payers seem to be realizing that excellent phase 3 results in an idealized patient population in a clinical trial with a drug doesn't really translate to patients' experience with that drug, with multiple chronic diseases and the burdens of polypharmacy in the real world. So this, at the end of my aside, let me just say that I'm sort of a call to action, I think, for our entire medical device community is to be willing to be bold in this industry, to enter and to try to win in these markets by finding opportunities to align patient, physician, and payer interests in order to improve the public health. Okay, with that aside done, I'd like to just come now to talk about COVID and the three major things that we were sort of thinking about and mentioned earlier: priorities, principle, and people. In early March, when it became clear that we were going to face a significant disruption from COVID, though we didn't really know how significant, we really didn't know how long it would last, we had just signed a contract with HCA to begin to commercialize, and we're gearing up for that. We were working with the FDA on our pivotal study, and we were forced to ask ourselves whether the changing environment really fundamentally affected the potential value of our opportunity. And one of the things that we realized as we were thinking through that is we felt like COVID was going to be a temporary phenomenon, but we just didn't know what temporary meant. Our plans had been to begin commercializing and to continue preparing for a pivotal study. And our first task was to reevaluate our priorities in light of this changed world we were now living in. We asked whether our core value proposition remained true in a COVID or post-COVID world. And then we asked whether each of the individual elements of our plan continued to make sense in that moment of this temporary but uncertain duration disruption. So as a leadership team, one of the things that we reminded ourselves is like this great Stephen Covey quote: the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And if this were easy, I don't think this quote would be used as often as it is. It can be very, very hard to remind yourself what the main thing is. We felt a few things about this. Number one, there was likely to be a short-term disruption to elective cases. Eventually, hospitals and physicians would need to return to their core businesses. And we were beginning to hear about how much money Partners was losing in Boston and other major hospitals were losing by not being able to do procedures that are certainly profitable for them and necessary for their core existence. So this was going to be a short-term disruption to elective cases, but elective cases would eventually have to come back. Second, our core need, our main thing, as it were, was to move our pivotal study forward in our IDE submission, our preparation for pivotal study execution. And we also knew that, or we felt like the pivotal study's overall timeline was going to extend beyond even very conservative estimates of how long COVID would affect us. So whatever would happen and however long that trough, eventually we would come out of it, elective procedures would resume, and we still would likely not be done with our pivotal trial. On the other hand, we received a call from our hospital partners in the United Kingdom that elective cases were stopped. Everyone was focusing on trying to flatten the curve in the United Kingdom, and there was really no opportunity to begin the commercialization at that moment that we were otherwise planning. So unlike for some companies, there was really no major opportunity created by COVID for us to move into some massive new market created by the space. I know there are other companies where that's happened with like a phenomenal new diagnostic or therapeutic or vaccine. We did not have that opportunity. All we knew is that we had an important unmet need, and that important unmet need would remain once we were on the other side of COVID, but we had to figure out how we were going to get through it. One of the things that sort of we started to think about is when you get to another layer of granularity, you realize that not everything that we're trying to do gets affected equally by COVID. Certain things actually gain from disruption, certain things lose from disruption. So what things lose, I mean, that was pretty obvious. Commercial launch was not going to happen. We had to make a very difficult decision to essentially hit the pause button on all commercially related activities until we allow the COVID pandemic to pass through. And that, in fact, is what we did. Instead of focusing on a commercial launch, we instead redoubled our efforts on securing reimbursement. Now, a lot of our work on commercial efforts in 2020 have been on establishing reimbursement and the basis for reimbursement in the UK and in the US. Business travel, obviously, is severely disrupted. We had a plan to go visit all of our sites and get them geared up for the pivotal trial. We really weren't able to do that. And so instead, we ended up hiring many more people in the field than we had originally anticipated, had to put them in places that were geographically designed in order to be able to deal with the fact that they may be able to travel locally, regionally, but not nationally or internationally in order to be able to help support our study. Another thing that led to, because of the inability to do business travel, is our plan for how we were going to train physicians in our pivotal study really got affected. We were going to bring everyone to pig labs in certain centers across the United States and train people in a large animal facility. We actually had to throw that plan out of the window. The thing that gained by that disruption, however, is that we built a really much more sophisticated proprietary bench model, one that did a much better job of replicating the human anatomy than the pig lab. I don't think we would have invested the time and the energy in that if we could have used the pig lab as our default. But actually, the training module that we've developed, we think is superior in a lot of ways, way more scalable and way more cost effective than what we had otherwise been able to do. So the fact that business travel was negatively affected actually accrued to our advantage in allowing us or forcing us to think about how we might amplify the scalability and quality of our training program much earlier than we would otherwise have planned to do so. And we also saw there were other things that really got better, as shown on the left side. Not traveling, not going to conferences really allowed us to spend dedicated time thinking and planning. We put together a really compelling pivotal study. We worked very closely with key opinion leaders, all of whom were stuck in their homes, also wondering how to take advantage of that time. And all of that planning and preparation, I think, really helped us do a much better job in getting ready for our trial than we otherwise would have done. So when we reevaluated our priorities, what we found is there were certain things that we absolutely had to decide that we weren't going to do. There were other things that we decided that we needed to do differently. And there were a whole other set of activities that we were able to do way better because of COVID than we otherwise would have. And I think sort of the big takeaway lesson for me in all of that is that not everything that you're doing gets affected equally by this disruption. And if you think hard about how you might benefit, where you might gain, you can find opportunities to advance your business in ways that you would not necessarily have anticipated, even though it wasn't actually what was in your plans. So moving on from refocusing or reorganizing one's priorities, I mean, let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is principle. We all need the capital in order to be able to sustain our businesses. And one unique challenge that we had, as you said before, is that because the disruption is not permanent, we're living in this weird interim state. We don't really know when things are going to return to normal or what even that new normal was going to be. Another challenge is that there are going to be some periods that are going to be less severe than others. We figure there's going to be waves of good times and bad times, and there's going to be regions that are going to do better and other regions that are not going to do so well. So how do you think about cash management and emphasis on execution in the face of all of that? Well, we thought really hard about our strategic options around cash management. And we felt confident that if we could see the company through this challenging period, that our Fractyl opportunity would be just as significant, if not even more significant, on the other side of COVID. As I mentioned earlier, we knew that hospitals were bleeding revenues, and we knew that we're naturally aligned actually with hospitals in trying to shift the paradigm of care from prescriptions to procedures in type 2 diabetes. So the question became, how do we continue to articulate the value proposition of Fractyl in the middle of this pandemic? How do you raise money? We were mortified that the risk of COVID would have a total chilling effect on the financing that we had been working so hard on coming together. Luckily, we had an incredibly supportive investment syndicate already lined up, in a new lead investor who remained incredibly steadfast through those difficult months at the beginning of the year. And we were able to go ahead and close on our financing through this very different process than anything I've ever been through before. Super abbreviated, video conferencing led, unable to build the type of close personal relationships that I had done in prior financings, but building a relationship in a different way, really built around navigating this exogenous shock together in an open and transparent way. So Fractyl was lucky. We had already secured a new lead investor. That lead investor was super, super supportive through this period, had a point of view that this was going to be something that the world was going to get through and the opportunity remained on the other side. And the other key decision that we made was we had not yet completely circled all of the money that we had intended, but we made the decision to go ahead and close on our financing as soon as possible once we saw that the risk of lockdowns were emerging in the United States. And so a big lesson there was to be transparent and collaborative with your investors, and then to be willing to take creative measures to be able to secure the capital that you need to keep your company going. We made it clear in our conversations that we were taking the risk of COVID extremely seriously, that we were developing a plan, we were positioning ourselves for how to emerge from COVID in a strong position for success. And I think all of that really accrued to our advantage in our fundraising efforts. But we also really made a point to our investors that we were going to focus our attention on finding ways to save money in exactly the moment that we were also working on raising it. And I felt like we had three big choices in how to save. I mean, one option on one end of the extreme was to just continue as is with the expectation that the economy would recover quickly, return to normal within a few months, and everything would be fine. A second option would be to scale back in a selective manner to extend our runway by acknowledging that we had to preserve the capital that we had, preserve the main thing. And that meant that we'd have to defer plans and activities on other priorities like commercialization in Europe, which we weren't going to be able to do at the same time, in order to be able to extend our runway a meaningful enough length of time to be able to give ourselves some options in order to be able to move our main thing forward. The third option, so option number one was to just continue as is. Option number two is to scale back, but to do so in a manner that extends runway meaningfully. The third option that we had was to go into hibernation mode and just sort of wait out the storm. Option one, to just continue as is, totally felt like the wrong thing to do instinctually. Honestly, in my mind, the question was whether to scale back modestly or to continue the storm metaphor, whether to just batten down the hatches really hard and hibernate. But we realized that in order to avoid taking that more drastic step, it was important to have a plan that allowed us to scale back enough to meaningfully extend the minimum runway. And in this setting, it was super important to have the willingness to plan creatively and objectively. And my CFO and I spent a lot of time together poring over spreadsheets, asking a set of really hard questions about what we could afford, what we couldn't afford. And we made very difficult choices in late March, early April to support the narrowing of our priorities. And if I look back since we started Fractyl, this was certainly the most difficult thing we've ever had to do as a company. But it really was absolutely critical to help us set ourselves up to be able to wait out those months, actually just weeks upon weeks, to see the trajectory of disease, to understand what the world was going to look like, to secure our pivotal IDE, to watch the progress of that storm, and to continue to reevaluate our opportunity as we saw COVID progressing. And then over the course of the next several weeks and months, to begin to hire the team that was going to help us execute the pivotal study once we had confidence that the trial could actually go on. Once we saw that elective procedures were resuming and we saw that the hospitals were figuring out a way to manage. So we really did a very delicate job of titrating our cash management and our planning to be ready for eventualities that were very severe in terms of backing up or slowing down, while at the same time being prepared to jump back in once we saw that things were beginning to look a little bit better. None of these steps was easy. I'm sure you've all faced this in your own companies. And it's sort of important to say that, on top of everything else, COVID-19 is obviously not just a business crisis, it's a health crisis. And we thought a lot about the importance of our people in helping us see a way through this. We really made it clear to the folks in our company that we're going to be as flexible as we possibly could in helping people adapt, working from home, taking time to manage their families, especially those with young kids. I've just been blown away, honestly, by the way in which the people in our company adapted and pushed forward through adversity. People who took care of their kids from 9 to 5 and then found ways to change their schedule around in order to be able to get done what needed to get done. And I felt like we really owed it to our people, given what they were going through, both in terms of their health and the constraints and challenges that they were facing, to do like 3 very specific things for our people. The first one is transparency. The second one is to reorganize our communication lines. And the third one is to really redouble our efforts on restoring and maintaining the shared sense of purpose and culture that we all already had. So one of the things that we did that really helped was, and we were super transparent about what we were observing. as well as the uncertainty about what that meant. We had weekly team meetings. We talked about the impact that COVID was having on our priorities and our thinking, the disruption, the uncertainty. I said, I don't know how many times, to questions that we were getting from our team, really good questions. And I made sure that I was not going to sugarcoat the reality in any way. And I think that this transparency really helped reinforce the trust that we had built, even though everyone knew that we had very difficult decisions ahead. And another thing that we did was to reorganize the ways in which our teams communicated internally with one another. We were a company where everyone was showing up to the same place every day. And we had a very proactive process, beginning with the end in mind, thinking about how we were going to communicate again in terms of what we're trying to accomplish, who's working on what, how do we make sure that people have as much autonomy as necessary so that they can work independently in their homes in this distributed work environment, which was new for us, and how do we balance that with the right amount of checking in and cross group communication to make sure that teams were aligned. So I learned that it's super important for leaders to over communicate during this time. I think that it became, I was really happy when people started to get frustrated because they felt like they had heard the same things over and over again, because it meant that I had said it enough. And also, something needed to be done to make up for the fact that people were not able to just bounce over to one another's desk or catch up in the hallways. So one specific thing that we did was we increased the number of peer-to-peer one-on-ones that people were doing. And we asked people to always do a quick check-in. What do you need from me? What do I need from you at every one of these one-on-ones to help ensure alignment? Simple questions, simple changes, but things that really help when everyone is working far apart from one another. Now, all of this is about focusing on priorities and focusing on what needs to be done, keeping the lights on. One thing that we did to really try to preserve our culture that I might share with you is we instituted this thing called virtual coffee breaks. We had built a really strong culture at Fractyl, great employee engagement. We really didn't want to lose that. So we recreated some of the spontaneity of in-office interactions through 30-minute, every couple of weeks, 3 to 4 people selected randomly, talking to people with whom you would never otherwise have an occasion to interact with when we're all at home. And these virtual coffee breaks have been a way for people in engineering and or manufacturing or clinical to get to know one another and to build bonds that I hope are going to help maintain that sense of cohesiveness as we move forward. So I'm just going to end now on a note of optimism. Obviously, yesterday there was this great news, actually maybe Monday, about the Pfizer vaccine, what that means about mRNA vaccines in particular, for their vaccine in particular, but mRNA vaccines in general. I think that we can say that this suggests that the COVID era, the end of the COVID era is in fact going to be visible, and this storm that we're all facing may yet pass. And if you're a company like ours, one that didn't necessarily find the greater opportunity from COVID than you had before, can still find a way to navigate through this time to find extraordinary success. And I found that focusing on narrowing our priorities, focusing on preserving capital and being really rigorous about maintaining flexibility in that, and empowering our people, and it's just going to continue to allow us to have as great of an opportunity in the future as we thought we had when we started this year on January 1st. So with that, I'm going to stop and would love to answer any questions that you might have.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much. Let's go to the Q&A. Our first question, the question about staff reduction. Did Fractyl has to do a staff reduction? If so, what disciplines did they shed? That's very specific. Marketing, R&D, sales.
Yeah,
others?
well, I think I started by talking about priorities, and then I started talking about principle and people. It's sort of, that's how we thought about it. What do we need to get done? How much money do we need in order to do that? And then who are the people that we need in order to help us accomplish that? Moving into a pivotal study requires a totally different set of skills and people than than doing commercialization in Europe. And so the people that we um, that we that we had to part ways with were people who were really much more suited to what we were thinking priorities were going to be in January 1st than what they ultimately ended up being by April 1st. And so that's how we adjusted. And so if you think about keeping the main thing, then you can quickly realize who are the folks that you need in order to be able to accomplish that main thing. Luckily, we worked really hard to try to make sure that everyone who left was able to go someplace really great, and we did everything we could to help them, and people were able to transition really successfully, and I'm very proud of that. But that was something that was a very hard time for us, as it was for so many others, I'm sure.
And with that difficulty, I'm sure, I feel like nowadays everybody feel burnt out much faster. And the question is, how do you recognize burnt out and how do you reverse it? And if you already...
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think that my one-on-ones with my leadership team have been a lot more about humanity than they were prior to COVID. How are you doing? How is your family doing? How are you coping with this changed world that we're living in? And, and then just being there for one another. And even though we were socially distanced, one of the points that I made is that doesn't mean we need to be emotionally distanced from one another. And so in some sense, we had to work harder on the emotional connection in order to try to help with that. And I think that we've made a point of that. And so I think burnout's also hard in a certain setting, because if you're sort of stuck in the same small apartment for a very long period of time, like that can just create a lot of burnout for people. And so we tried our best to help in whatever way we can, but that thankfully hasn't been a major issue.
Another question is not related to the burnout, but it's more about managing the fundraising during the COVID. And I've done it very well. And granted that you also had that lead investors before the whole COVID break, is like, what would you advise somebody who right now is in the middle of the fundraising, whether they have the lead investor or not have the lead investor, they still have to get that principal?
Right. Well, I think that literally today may be the best day to think about kicking off a fundraising that you could possibly imagine. And the reason I say that is because the Pfizer news, the fact that the election is more or less over. I don't know why I have to laugh at that, but I guess you all know, right? The election is more or less over. The market's been really incredibly happy with both of these pieces of news in the last several days. I think that now is a really great time. I mean, there's no one who's going to be fundraising a significant amount of money who's going to have major milestones occurring within the span of time that we're still going to be under lockdown. And so you just need to, I think my one small piece of advice is articulate a very clear recognition that COVID still exists and is going to impact your business, and you have a strategy for how you're going to deal with it. And yet the opportunity on the other side of this is getting clearer, and to articulate that value proposition. I think investors are now more than ever totally ready to recognize and essentially invest in that post-COVID future. And so I would encourage you, if you're thinking about it, like now is as good of a time as any to start.
And how do you build that relationship with the investors when, like you mentioned, it's different. It's, through the Zoom, you don't have that personal relation building moment, but still can be done. How do you do that through Zoom? Do you have a technique, or do you have a tips on how best way to do it?
Yeah, I think be real. I think that ultimately at the end of the day, if you're the principal fundraiser for your company, people are going to be making a bet on you, and as much as they are on your team and the technology and the market. And I think that people are looking for ways to figure out how to be real with one another on Zoom. It's the part about burnout that we talked about earlier. And so I would probably invest as much time in building that relationship, even though it's via video conference, as you would if you were in person. And just because it's over a video conference, don't just naturally assume that it's going to be an impersonal one. And then I think one of the things that I've noticed is that there's a much greater efficiency from being able to do this via Zoom than having to schlep around in planes and taxis. And so there's an opportunity to invest perhaps a little bit more time in that relationship building because people are spending less time getting from point A to point B in this whole process.
And I would recommend turning on the camera too.
Without a doubt. Yeah, turn on the camera and recognize that you're going to be judged in some way by your appearance on that screen and what's behind you, right? So making sure that you are, just cognizant of the fact that people are going to be looking for clues and cues, however they find them, in order to understand more about you, as much as they're trying to understand your business.
Mm-hmm. So let's see, we have maybe one more question.
Okay.
Were there any pandemic-related hurdles that Fractyl and you and the team could not overcome? And what changes adopted by Fractyl to do that?
Well, we couldn't make elective cases happen, right? So we do a GI endoscopy procedure. We can't make that happen. There's no way to make that happen. And I think as we answered earlier, we made decisions about commercializing in 2020 on the basis of the fact that we knew that was something we just weren't going to change. I would probably say that's the biggest and the best example of something that we had to fundamentally alter as a result of this.
Okay. Well, that should cover it. Well, thank you so much for sharing your tips, and that's definitely even we can. I mean, I'm not running a startup, but even in our organization, we can learn a lot from your story.
Thank you, Christine. I really appreciate it. It was a pleasure.
Okay, thanks. Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you.